And welcome. And today I'm going to be presenting on the integration view, which is one of Johnson's 5 views on integrating or relating the two fields of psychology and Christianity, and then how it applies to my research area of intercultural competence. So this is an overview. First, I'll go through the view itself as Jones within Johnson's book of the 5 views has delineated and outlined it. Then I'll go into my chosen research area of intercultural competence and how I apply that within psychology research. And then finally, just wrapping it up with a conclusion. So just to overview the issue here, why we need to relate psychology and Christianity. Historically, there's been a lot of tension between the fields. A lot of people and scholars in the past have noted that a lot of times psychology and Christianity have issues where they don't align. And so the 5 views that Johnson outlines attempts to overcome those barriers with different ways of relating the two for specifically individuals, scholars, practicing psychologists who are trying to do both, be an authentic Christian and also practice psychology or do psychology research. So as I mentioned, my chosen viewpoint is integration view. Integration view, along with the other 4 views that Johnson outlines, maintains the integrity of both psychology and theology. That's an important assumption. Integration view and none of the views actually deprioritize either psychology or theology in terms of their value. It's some views just prioritize one or the other in terms of preference or depending on the field, such as biblical counseling. Biblical counseling prefers sources like the Bible and theology, whereas other views like levels of explanation, because it tends to be more people who are practicing or doing research and publishing research, and to prefer empirical findings. In contrast to that, integration view views truth from both psychological and theology sources equally, and instead weighs the evidence from multiple sources of truth. So in this way, another key assumption of integration view is that intellectual humility is needed in order to weigh the evidence, because going into a certain problem, a certain psychological issue, a person who holds to integration view doesn't necessarily know which source of truth will ultimately be the arbiter or be able to answer the specific question. So in this way, the sources of truth or potential sources of truth can include the Bible, can include theological sources, historical sources, philosophy, or psychological empirical evidence. And in this way, integration view proponents do trust in modern psychology, evidence-based sources, recent empirical evidence. So that's a similarity with levels of explanation. However, maybe a distinction from levels of explanation is that integration view holds to a distinctive understanding of human nature, that if you are a Christian, if you have a biblical worldview, then you're perhaps going to be able to understand science, understand psychology better, because you have, similar to Christian psychology, transformational psychology, biblical counseling, all of those proponents believe that with a biblical worldview, you have an enhanced view of the world. And so in this way, the primary allegiance for integration view isn't going to be either the church or the broader community. It's going to serve both the broader community of scholars as well as the church. But going back also a little bit to this idea of the distinctive understanding of humanity, the primary task of psychology in the eyes of an integration view proponent is going to be the renovation of humanity and helping people, or using a Christian worldview to have an enlightened view of humanity and the world. So now applying or explaining my area of research, which is intercultural competence. Intercultural competence is actually a newer field within psychology. It came from other fields such as communication, sociology, education. But in the past couple of decades, it has really emerged in psychology with some scientific studies that have more empirically and scientifically studied concepts such as, for me specifically, how undergraduates are developing intercultural competence and which experiences such as multicultural courses versus things like study abroad trips effectively develop intercultural competence. But before we get into that a little bit, a little definition of terms is needed. So culture, a term that is a lot of times ambiguous. A recent literature review of a lot of intercultural competence research define culture as an individual shared communicable framework of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. In this way, it's a little bit maybe broader than sometimes the word culture is used colloquially. Sometimes it's, or a lot of times it's used to refer to racial or ethno-linguistic identity. But in the scientific research, it tends to be broader than that. It's any really group identity. But a lot of times we do use that word to refer to race, ethnicity, linguistic identity. So in this way, that's culture, and an intercultural competence then is the ability to traverse different cultures, the attitudes, cognitions, and skills, or in other words, affective, cognitive, and behavioral things needed in order to have effective and appropriate interaction with people who belong to different groups or have different group identities. So now we get into some of the research in IC. One of the more widely held models, frameworks in intercultural competence is Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. This model is kind of a framework for how a person goes from an ethnocentric view, viewing their culture as superior to others, to an ethno-relative view, and that is prescribed as the goal in Bennett's DMIS theoretical framework. It's the goal to get to an ethno-relative standpoint where you are not viewing your own culture as superior to another culture, but you're integrating cultures together and taking maybe the best of your own culture and the best of another culture and fusing a new culture, as it were. So some application here with integration view. So in viewing things like the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity and also being a authentic Christian, trying to weigh what that means for a Christian to adhere to this widely held evidence-based theoretical framework, it is important as an integration view component to weigh the evidence. And you can even see that in scripture. Acts 17:11 is one of my favorite verses that talks about the Berean church. When Paul was preaching and speaking, they would actively test what he was saying against the scriptures and against what they knew. They weren't just blindly accepting what he was saying. So I thought that was a very fitting verse that encapsulated the spirit of integration view. And so with that approach, if we go ahead and evaluate the DMIS, then we have the scale of ethno-relativism to ethnocentrism. And while that may seem appealing, especially in today's age, looking in light of scripture and biblical ideas, we see in First Corinthians, and then going back to Paul, Paul talks a lot in First Corinthians about the church and how people within the church should relate to each other. A lot of diversity in the church as well as with others. And a key idea here is that when you are a Christian, it's very important not to let go of your core convictions of the gospel and what the gospel actually means, what is outlined in the biblical worldview and the biblical meta-narrative. It's not something to be let go in the process of ethno-relativism when you're, as Bennett describes, taking some elements of your own cultural identity and taking other elements of other cultural identities and maybe fusing them together. That's not exactly what the biblical and the Christian way to do things is. However, also in First Corinthians is this idea of not just holding on so firmly to your own cultural identity with all its uh, not just talking about the essential things, but maybe the non-essential things, the things that are not core to a Christian worldview. Um, we are to not just hold on to our similarities in the church, but also embrace diversity and um, basically celebrate that and move forward with a shared vision within the church in order to bring others in as well. So that is kind of the idea there. That's one example in applying integration view to this research area of intercultural competence. And in conclusion, integration view just provides a really, I would say, holistic way of relating psychology and Christianity. One of the limitations that's noted in Johnson's book is that there's no particular methodology in this process of weighing the evidence, but that is, you know, maybe one of the mystical, not mystical, but kind of mysterious things as well about our faith versus uh, our many Christians, our faith versus what we do as either practicing psychologists or people who are conducting psychology research, and something that maybe can be developed in the future. But yeah, so thank you for listening to my presentation. And